Part 22.
They're the nicest creatures in the whole world. Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and I'm sure you'll believe me. My friends, this is Centipede, and let me make it known, he is so sweet and gentle that, although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone when nurse is off and all the royal children are all alone. Small wonder, said a fireman, is no longer on the throne. The earthworm, on the other hand, said James, beginning to expand, is great for digging up the land and making old soils newer. Moreover, you should understand he should be absolutely grand for digging up subway tunnels and for making you a sewer. The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried, could any words be truer? And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, is a boon in billions and millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays, and he plays, and he plays. As a toy for your children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You're only to tickle the sole of his feet, and he hops, and he hops, and he hops. He can't be fierce, exclaimed the head of all the cops. And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She is easy to install on your ceiling or your wall. And although this smacks a bit of eccentricity, it's rather very clever, for thereafter you will never, ever, ever, ever have the slightest need for using electricity. And no than 52 policemen cried out, if this is true, that creature will get some fabulous publicity. And here we have Miss Spider with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested me to say that she has never even met Miss Muffet on her charming little tuffet. If she had, she'd not have frightened her away. Should her look sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it should harm you to repeat at last 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider. I must only help and guide her, and invite her into the nursery to play. The police all nodded slightly, and the firemen smiled politely. About a dozen people cried, hooray! And here's my darling ladybug, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She has 400 children, and she's left them all behind, but they're coming on the next peach if they can. The cops cried, she's entrancing. All the firemen started dancing, and the crowds all started cheering to a man. And now the silkworm, James went on, whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia. If you should search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you could find one bit of silk that could compare with it. Even in the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff. And what is more, this silkworm had, I'll have you know, the honor not so long ago to spin and weave and sew and press the Queen of England's wedding dress. And she's already made and sent a waistcoat for your president. Well, good for her, the cops cried out. And all at once, a mighty shout went up across the Empire State. Let's get him down at once. Why wait? 5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone who had come over on the peach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of City Hall, where the mayor of New York City made a speech of welcome. And while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks, armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys, swarmed up to the top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant peach off the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the mayor shouted, we must now have a ticker tape parade for our wonderful visitors. And so a procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, sat James and all of his friends. Next came the giant peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto a very large truck, and there it now sat, looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom of it where the spike of the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that? Or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping out onto the street. Behind the peach, skidding about all over the place in the peach juice, came the mayor's limousine. And behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They leaned out of the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and ticker tape. And James and his friends stood up in their car and waved back at them as they went by. Then a very curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress came out of the crowd and shouted, "James! James! Could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvelous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. It won't last forever." No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped onto the truck and swarmed like ants all over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what was happening spread quickly from street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children a mile long, chasing after the peach as it proceeded slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people, it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamelin had suddenly descended upon New York City. And to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as this in the whole world, it was the most marvelous thing that had ever happened. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was standing on the truck. See, here they are in the parade.